And thanks for coming today. Ben is a colleague of mine. We have a paper together that we've labored over for quite some time and has gone through revision and is being submitted again in the near future. But this is a project I know nothing about. It's totally unrelated to our work together. And Ben's also a lab mate of mine, and I'm excited to hear more about it. Ben, this is your first time coming to one of our events, so I'll quickly tell you kind of what the seminar group is. Essentially, when COVID began, Jacob and a few other guys and I missed being able to go get coffee and talk about our research. And so we started sort of doing that. And then it spiraled out of control when I discovered that like famous academics would sometimes say yes when I emailed and asked them to give talks. And now it's a full-blown seminar group that has regular meetings and a Slack and whatnot. But we're very informal. And what Ben's doing today is kind of a cool thing that people can do, which is that Ben's going to present a paper, which he's also presenting at a prestigious conference in the near future. And that is to say, we can be a good way to practice your paper presentation. So if any of you have a paper that you're going to present somewhere and you'd like to practice it in front of like at least a moderately intelligent audience, such as myself and the rest of us, then I highly recommend the Boston Computation Club as a way to do that. So with that, Ben, I'll let you take it away. Thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to give this talk to you guys. Let me share my screen here. Oh, can you?
Oh yeah, I probably have to fix this. This is a perpetual Zoom problem, which I am not quite bright enough to have planned ahead for. Okay, you can share now.
Okay. Cool. Can you all see my screen? Okay, cool. So the paper that I'm going to be presenting at the IEEE Security and Privacy on the Blockchain workshop it's called Structural Attacks on Local Routing and Payment Channel Networks. And this was done by myself, my advisor, and Max's advisor, Christina, and our collaborator in the Netherlands, Stephanie Roos. So this sort of starts with the blockchain. The blockchain is sort of like touted as the savior of humanity. And this is my favorite headline here: fighting world hunger with blockchains. I don't know what that means, but anyway, people are saying that. But of course, blockchains aren't perfect. They have a lot of constraints and drawbacks. One of which is that they scale pretty poorly in general. Bitcoin has a maximum throughput of about 7 to 10 transactions per second. They have high transaction fees. As throughput is limited, the value of getting your transaction approved increases, so that contributes to these high transaction fees. Privacy is not as good as people think, because you have to announce these transactions to the entire network. So it's inherently there's some metadata leakage there, and you can often use that to de-anonymize people. And they're often quite inefficient. Most cryptocurrencies, most blockchains use proof of work, which is like burning silicon. So one improvement to this is something called an off-chain payment, or a payment channel. And this works by keeping the transactions off of the blockchain, which is sort of the bottleneck of this whole system. And so it increases throughput, lowers fees, and makes everything a little bit more private. And since it's reducing the load on the blockchain network, it makes the blockchain per se more efficient itself. So my talk will consist of 4 parts. I'll give some background about payment channel networks. I'll talk about some of the attacks we've investigated in payment channel networks, and I'll talk about our evaluation and some countermeasures.
Sorry, can I ask you a quick question here before we get started too much?
Please.
I don't know if it's a good time to answer it or if it'll be later in the talk, but this sort of perspective of taking stuff off the chain makes things faster. That's also true if you like stop using blockchain and use physical US dollars. It happens to make the blockchain faster as well. So I don't know if that's a sensible place to press, but I am more curious about the logistics of that and how you still get benefits of the blockchain if you're off the chain.
Yeah, I mean, if you stop using the blockchain and use something else, like you would have that effect of making it faster. But the idea, the reason that we're engaging this research is because digital currencies are useful, and having a decentralized currency is something that that's desirable for a lot of people.
Yeah. So there's still some interaction with the chain.
Yes, there is still some interaction with the blockchain. Yeah, and I'll get to that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the way a payment channel works, the payment channel is sort of the core component of this system. And the idea is that there are two parties, and they agree on some to allot each other some amount of credit that they can do with a Bitcoin script, or a blockchain, a smart contract in general. And so they'll allot each other this credit through a blockchain transaction. Now, if either of them wants to pay the other, they don't have to continue to put new transactions on the blockchain. They can just come up with a document that states what the new system state is. They sign it. So in this case, Alice is signing this state over here and sends it to Bob, who appends his signature to it. And now they both agree and have evidence that they agree on the new state. They can, at this point, no one else is aware of this transaction. That's where this sort of privacy aspect comes in. And they can continue to do these transactions off-chain as many times as they want, so long as the balances allow for the transactions that they're trying to complete. At some point, one of them might want to close their channel and get the liquid funds back in their possession. And at this point, they would submit this doubly signed transaction back to the blockchain, which has a smart contract that will process it, and the payout will go accordingly. So that's how a single payment channel works, but you can't open up an infinite number of payment channels, or rather, it's costly to open up payment channels, so you don't want to do it too many times. But since every participant in the network can have multiple payment channels, the channels themselves can form sort of a graph, which we call a payment channel network. So if, in this example, if A wants to pay H, all they have to do is find a path through this network that that has enough credit on each of the links to allow this payment to go through. And each of these is an individual payment channel transaction. There are some complications with this. For one, there could be a lot of channels. Two, the balances are changing every time a transaction is made, which is unlike routing in communication networks, where if you route a message, your bandwidth doesn't decrease. It's just, I guess it's decreased while the message is being broadcast, but not otherwise. And they need to be atomic, because you don't want just some of these to complete. There is one operational payment channel network. Actually, there's two. One of them is very small. The largest one is called the Lightning Network. And the way the Lightning Network operates is that it finds the path that I just discussed by something called source routing. So source routing means that the client will come up with the path through the whole network. They look at the entire topology and they say, this is the shortest path, or this is the path that I want to take. This has some complications. Like I said before, the topology, the network graph, can be large. So if it's, say, a million nodes, that means that a million messages need to be broadcast per transaction per channel. So that's obviously a big problem. The Lightning Network is not a million nodes right now, so it kind of works out. The other challenge that the Lightning Network runs into is that the path is onion routed. So, or rather, the payment is onion routed. So no node knows the entire path that the payment is taking. But this has some security flaws because the source, if they're malicious, could put in a bunch of loops so that payments keep going over the same links over and over again, which will destabilize the links. It'll basically move all of the balance from one side to the other and make a link unusable in one direction.
And I love that you're using the James Mickens figure. Everybody should go read the James Mickens paper after this.
I love any opportunity to use his artwork. So one solution to this source routing problem is dynamic routing or local routing. And one paper that does this, or one system that does this, probably the most prominent system in the payment channel space, is called Speedy Murmurs. And it does this by building a spanning tree of the network graph and assigning addresses to nodes in the tree. And when a payment takes place, it'll route it along the paths in the tree. It's actually in practice a little more efficient than that because the tree needs to have some kind of hierarchical nature, but there can be connections that create shortcuts between different branches. And so in that case, if a node is sending a transaction and sees that one of its connections has an address that's very close to the recipient, then it can just route directly along that address. There are a few nice privacy properties. One is that no node knows the whole path because the path isn't decided until it's actually routed. There is some cryptography involved, some basic cryptography. They use hashing to preserve node identities. And they also split the payments into random sized chunks and route them along multiple spanning trees simultaneously. So multiple spanning trees are generated at the beginning, and every time a payment is made, pieces of that payment will go along with the individual spanning trees, like so. So one last piece that's important background for payment channel networks is that the payments are atomic. Like I said, you don't want a case where some of the links complete transactions and others fail, because then some node will lose out on money it was owed. And so the way this is done, generally speaking, is through something called a hash time lock contract, which let's take this example where A wants to pay H. What happens is H will submit an invoice to A that includes a hash of some number X. And then A makes the payment to B and D to E, et cetera, all the way down to H. And each of these payments is pending completion upon, or is conditional upon the knowledge of H's preimage. So after E has committed to paying H based on the preimage of a hash, then H can release the preimage and they can propagate the transaction backwards. And this way everybody is guaranteed payment if they make payment themselves.
Can I ask a quick question? Oh, you're about to go into attacks on that. Okay, never mind.
Yeah. So starting with the threat model, we consider that attackers can corrupt any node in the network. This could be via social engineering or any other kind of hacking that you can imagine. Although we assume that they can't break cryptographic primitives. Attackers can collude out of band, so essentially anything an attacker knows is public. And the attackers have the following pieces of knowledge, which also non-attackers have this knowledge, but the topology, the initial channel balances, and the routing algorithm. The topology and the initial channel balances are published on the blockchain. So I mean that is public information in the purest sense. The other thing that all participants in the network know is the depth of their the subtree they're in the spanning tree. If speedy murmurs is the algorithm used. And the reason this is the case is because each node receives an embedding, this address here, and a node's embedding is just whatever its parent's embedding was, plus some additional number. So this node here, this bottom node has a parent with an embedding 1, 2, which is how it starts, and then it appends one additional number on top of that. And so it knows it's 4 layers deep because the landmark, the root, always has the empty embedding. Okay, so now we consider the attacks themselves. And the attack works like this. Consider that A is paying E. And like we said, there is, while the payment is in progress, each of the nodes has committed some amount to the transaction, though the transaction isn't completed yet. Now, if E here was a malicious node, they could delay releasing the pre-image of this hash, and another node, say B here, trying to pay F, would be unable to complete this payment because the CD link doesn't have enough funds on it. So what's interesting is that the payment could this initial payment from A to E, this green payment, could actually fail. In fact, E might decide to wait long enough that the payment times out. And in this case, the green payment from A to E and the red payment from B to F would both fail, even though the network could have supported one of them. So it's interesting that a node can stop a transaction from occurring even when it's not on the path that transaction would take. Also, the intermediate nodes generally receive some kind of transaction fee for completed transactions, and they lose out on that if no transactions complete. So it's not good for any of these intermediate nodes. So the research questions that we set out to answer are: 1, how much damage can this attack do? 2, how does an attacker's placement in the network topology influence its attack effectiveness? And can a practical attack that could occur in real life be as effective as some idealized Oracle attacker, which I'll explain a little bit in a bit. So we did this by way of simulation. And sorry, was there a question? Okay. So we started with a discrete event simulator from the Speedy Murmurs author. This isn't a deployed system, so we have to use a simulator. Also, it's a financial network, so we don't want to deprive people of actual money. We also had to generate some data sets representing the graphs and transactions, which has actually ended up being a much more difficult task than we initially anticipated. Our data set is it consists of a scale-free topology generated with the Barabasi-Albert algorithm after some other people, Rohr et al., measured the Lightning Network and found it to be scale-free. We modeled a network of 10,000 nodes, which was about twice the size of the Lightning Network when we started, but is now about the size of the Lightning Network. And we did this with about 100,000 transactions. The sender and recipient pairs were sampled individually from Poisson distributions, which is something that is a good model according to some economic journal articles. And the transaction values are sampled from a Pareto distribution also from the economic literature. Yeah. So starting with, our attack, to get a baseline of how powerful these attacks are, we randomly distributed attackers throughout the network. And we found that when they're randomly distributed, you don't hit this maximum effectiveness until about 30% or 20% of the network consists of attackers, which is quite a bit. Yeah, you might notice that the success ratio, even when there are 0 attackers, is quite low. That has to do a little bit with the Speedy Murmur's algorithm itself, because it doesn't, once it's sort of chosen a path through this dynamic routing, it doesn't have a way to backtrack if it doesn't have enough credit. And so, possibly more credit on the links would help the success ratio in general. Yeah. So now that we've seen what random attackers can do, we can consider what effect location has on an attacker. And looking at these two little toy models, we can see that the attacker on the right has a much more privileged location in the network. And so what does that mean in practice? Well, in the case of Speedy Murmurs, we could consider how changing a node's position in the tree structure could change the efficacy of their attack. And like we said, nodes, they know where they are in the network. They know where they are in the spanning tree just based on the length of their embedding. And we also found that due to this network using tree routing, the higher you go in the tree, the more transactions you're likely to see. But there's sort of a trade-off there, because the higher you go in the tree, the more likely there will have been to see a shortcut that means that you don't need to continue going up the tree. So what we found through some measurements is that the second or third layer of the tree is actually the most powerful in terms of the number of transactions that go through them. So an attacker can just leave the tree if they're in a position they don't like and rejoin somewhere else with a more privileged position. And so when we do this kind of attack, we see that we reach maximum efficacy with only 3% of the network being attackers, as opposed to 20%, as was the case before. Now, I wanted to bring up this diagram again because it doesn't actually get, I kind of blew wind over why that worked, that location is important, but there's actually a way to formalize this. And that way is a notion called betweenness centrality. And the betweenness centrality of a node is if you look at this sigma SR here, this is the number of shortest paths that connect node S and node R. And sigma SRN is the number of shortest paths between S and R that include node N. So this is the ratio or the percentage you could think of shortest paths from S and R that include node N, and you sum that up for all S and R. And that would be the between the centrality of a particular node. And so if we use that as our selection criteria to choose nodes, we see that even with just 0.1% attackers, we reach maximum effectiveness. And 0.1% attackers in a network of 10,000 nodes is about 10 nodes. So this is quite a powerful attack. For comparison, I mean, here's the random tree depth and centrality attacks. There's also this oracle attack we discussed before. Since we're generating the data set, and we can know ahead of time what paths are going to be taken, we can see which nodes are going to see the most transactions. And if we make those nodes the attacker, as some oracle would, then that would be the maximum possible attack effectiveness. And so we see that all of these attacks reach maximum effectiveness, but only the centrality attack does so with the same number of attackers as the oracle. So there's some interest in stopping the feasibility of these kind of attacks. And the core of the problem is that these networks are highly centralized, which happens naturally in financial networks. But this could be ameliorated by incentivizing different kinds of networks. So one of the types of networks we tried is called a small world network. Small world networks, they form based on different incentives, but they do form naturally in other types of networks that occur in the world. So we generated a small world network using the Newman-Watts-Strogatz algorithm, and again, selecting attackers by between the centrality, we see that that there's very little variation or deviation from the 0% attacker case. Yeah, so this turns out to be sort of what our future work might be, is that we don't know exactly what those incentives might be that would generate a small world network. We also, the dynamic in the context of PCNs are not well understood, though we believe that they are going. And yeah, and with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ben.
Yeah.
I don't have an immediate question to get us started, but maybe someone else does. Please just unmute yourself and go for it, and we'll mitigate talking over each other on the fly as best as possible.
I've got one question, which is about a different potential attack going back to the time lock hashing section.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess that wasn't the main point of the talk, so we didn't go into it too long. But what I was thinking about in this section is that hashes are great for security when you don't have any idea about what the pre-image could be. So when people generate all these different passwords, as long as they're not short and low entropy, that's generally a pretty good metric. But on something like this, if your pre-image is about a transaction, then that's something that's potentially more predictable. So I guess I'm sort of curious.
So I see what you're getting at. The pre-image actually doesn't necessarily have to relate to the transaction at all. It can just be a random number. All you have to say is that in this case, where H is the end recipient, they need to just come up with some random number, create the hash for it, and then just send that hash to A. And so A will have all the payment details that they're going to make using the hash sent from H, but they're not. Yeah, the hash from H doesn't really depend on any other data.
Gotcha. So you don't need the transaction in there. It's just sort of you achieve a notion of ordering when you have them all layered, like hash of a hash of a hash type thing. Or am I misunderstanding?
So there isn't. There aren't multiple different hashes. There's just one hash. So H does the hash of some pre-image X and then sends it to A, and then A will send that same hash to B, and B will send that same hash to D, and D to E, and E to H. And then and this transaction from E to H will only be released when the pre-image is released to E, because E can then verify that the pre-image is the pre-image of the hash that they were waiting on. And so it's all just the same hash being propagated backwards.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like some weird flavor of a poor man's public key when you reveal the secret.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
what was that?
No, you're good. That makes sense.
Okay,
I've got more questions, but I can let someone else jump.
Yeah, so a little bit on that. There's some cryptographers are trying to change this HCLC system. Yeah, I wish I knew more about it, but my cryptography is not great. So.
And I've had this experience that whenever I talk to Bitcoin people or listen to Bitcoin people talk, and by Bitcoin people, I just pejoratively mean anybody who studies anything related to blockchains, they always seem to be utterly convinced that like nobody would bother to do an attack if it costs money. Like they always use these weird financial arguments where they're like, well, the attacker won't make more money by attacking than what they would have made by washing dishes. So why wouldn't they just get a job washing dishes or something? I don't know. And I've always found that really unconvincing because like we spend money on missiles and we don't get a return on investment by shooting someone with a missile, but we still do it all the time. And I wonder, is there like have you encountered this type of pushback with this research? Is there some like kind of spurious, weird financial argument against it? And what are your thoughts on this type of thing?
Yeah, so we have come across this kind of pushback. The thing is that this attack won't directly generate any money for the attacker, and so some people ask, why would anyone engage in this attack? Is there sufficient incentive? But like you said, there are incentives in tearing down a system. If a lot of people are depending on the system to do some financial transaction, then stopping this is a major inconvenience and has a financial impact on those participants. So even though you're not directly making money, I think it's still something you have to be aware of and you have to watch out for it. Try to prevent it.
Totally.
Okay, well, I've got another question then, which is that this is sort of a very interesting distributed system that's, correct me if I'm wrong, but seems like, it would be really great if Ethereum and Bitcoin were already set up to handle money in a good way, but they come up short. So we'll come up with this more specialized design in some cases. So I'm curious about that kind of trade-off, because there are a lot of things in Bitcoin that are quite simple and you can sort of trust that they'll be fine even if they're bad. One example being proof of work, where it's like, there's a computation that happens with really low probability, so that if everyone's trying to compute it, that's hard to attack, even if it like destroys the environment. But it seems like there are a lot of good but complex ideas in this system. So I guess, can you talk a little bit about the trade-offs and kind of some properties you might lose by going off-chain that the blockchains have worked pretty hard to preserve?
Yeah. Let's see, what kind of properties would you lose? Well, you don't have, in general, you aren't going to have smart contracts, which are valuable. Although there's some work in something called a generalized state channel, where I pointed out before that Alice and Bob are just exchanging some state. And this doesn't, strictly speaking, need to be financial balances. I've heard people talk about like playing a chess game or something, some kind of board game. I think there would be some like interesting gambling applications. I don't really know much more beyond that for those types of state channels. I think what you gain in a payment channel network is basically you're hiding a lot of the back and forth from the blockchain, which is expensive. And I don't see this as being like a detractor from a blockchain system. A lot of the developers of the Lightning Network are themselves Bitcoin Core developers. So I think a lot of them see this as like the way forward, because Bitcoin is basically stuck at like 7 transactions a second, and it can only grow so much when that's the bottleneck. And so I think there's a lot of people are hopeful of a different way forward. There are some blockchains that have some fancy cryptography that makes them much more private. There's like Zcash, I believe, is sort of the state of the art there. And the problem with Zcash is it's even less efficient than Bitcoin. It's just very slow because good cryptography is often very expensive. So yeah, I guess there are, okay. Here's another piece that's kind of a complication that's a bit of a loss. So I didn't discuss what can happen if an attacker decides to submit a transaction that's not the latest state, because remember, they both have old states just stored on their computer, and they could submit one. So in this case, this transaction, which Alice will also have, has Alice having 8 and Bob having 2. So if Bob submitted this one because he gets more money out of it, then basically Alice needs to be constantly watching the blockchain to know if this happens. And built into the smart contract from the channel opening, there's some mitigation where Alice can submit a newer state that Bob has signed, and then some penalty can be enforced. In many cases, the full payout of the channel will go to the counterparty of the malicious actor. But that means that Alice still needs to be watching the blockchain and be online at all times. And then you kind of get into this like the secondary the secondary market, where there's something called watchtowers, where you pay somebody to watch the blockchain for you at all times. Yeah, I mean, this is an additional complication. It's an additional moving part that's not strictly necessary for like a monetary transaction, but it's necessary in this system. So yeah, that's kind of a big research area. People looking into watchtowers and how they can communicate securely with watchtowers and share some amount of cryptographic material such that the watchtower could actually enforce something that they see while not allowing them access to your funds directly.
In the 7
Awesome.
transactions. Oh, the 7 transactions per second, is that for an individual, say, blockchain user, or is that like a number that applies to an entire network or a subset of the network?
So that applies to the entire Bitcoin network. Different networks have different throughputs, but the Bitcoin network as a whole will append blocks every 10 minutes. And I believe there's the thing that this number of 7 comes from is that there's some size of a block. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, maybe yeah, a few megabytes. And so it's however many transactions you can fit in that number of megabytes. And transactions can be of various sizes. But if they're as small as possible, then the number of transactions will come out to about 7 per second.
And is there a mechanism for allocating the transactions, like transaction fees, and are they dynamic or?
What do you mean allocating?
Well, essentially, right? Because if like say 8 people want to transact in 1 second, right? How is like what is determined? Who gets to transact first, right? Is it just like on a first come first served basis, basically?
Okay, so how it works is that a node that wants to do a transaction, they send it out to the network. They do something called gossiping, which means they tell the nodes they're connected to, and those nodes tell the nodes they're connected to, and it'll spread throughout the world in really just a few seconds. And the miners who are actually making these blocks and doing this proof of work hashing, they'll look at all the transactions that they received recently, and they generally the rational strategy is that they look at the transaction fees of those transactions. And so since they have a limited number of slots in the block that they're going to mine, they'll generally choose the transactions with the highest fees.
Okay.
That they get paid the most.
That makes sense.
Which this, I actually have another work ongoing where we're looking at, so this, when the transactions are sent out and collected by the miners, they're collected in something called the mempool. And the mempool, if you're watching the mempool carefully, you can actually, you can engage in what's called front running, which means that you can, well, there's different kinds of front running, but one thing you can do is if somebody's trying to buy some currency from someone else, you can buy it from that person at some price and then sell it to the other person at a slightly higher price. That's still within the range that they're willing to pay. And so basically you're just like skimming a little bit off the top of every transaction. And there's quite a bit of this going on in Ethereum.
How feasible would it be to use like a legitimate parallel transaction to path force to kind of route the target transaction onto bad nodes, etc.?
Well, I didn't follow that. What do you mean by parallel?
I wasn't quite sure about how the dynamic weighting worked, but you were saying other transactions do affect the network, right?
Oh, what I was trying to get at with so what I was getting at here is that E is an attacker here, and B is paying F some amount of money, and so E is not really connected to this payment path at all. They're only connected to this link, which is not on the path. Yet they can still cause this payment to fail. So, which can make the attack harder to detect because the nodes you might suspect are not just these nodes that are on the path. They're anyone who could have been using that path or a subset of that path. Does that answer your question?
No, I got that part. That's not quite what I was asking. I think it was earlier that you mentioned waiting, but
What,
I should just look at the gossip protocol thing like from the bottom up and answer that. My bad.
okay, yeah, I'm not sure what which weighting you're referring to.
Well, then I guess in general, are there other path forcing strategies there?
Path forcing strategies?
Because there'd be like options on the B and C there, for example,
Oh,
hypothetically.
on this one?
Yeah.
So, I mean, in this,
So to make sure that the way it gets from the way it reaches F is through C and D, so that way you can take advantage of having E.
yeah, I mean, in this particular
Because it would
network,
be larger than that 6-node graph normally.
can you say that last part again? You broke up a little.
I said just because it would be normally the network or sub-network of choice would be larger than that, no?
Yeah. So in general, yeah, I mean, this is like a toy example. B would have potentially other options to get to F, but we're looking at the case of dynamic routing. So in this case, they only know the first link. They know, B looked at C and said, okay, this link has enough credit, and so I'm gonna lock up credit along this link. And only when the transaction had gotten to here did it become apparent that there was not enough available credit for this transaction to continue. But it is possible in a larger network that even if a node is blocking some links, that payments could still complete.
Gotcha.
Ben, did you come up with the attack in the first place, or was this like a well-known possibility that hadn't been explored on this particular network?
We did not come up with the attack. We got this funding from Ripple, from the Ripple network, and we had some discussions with an engineer, and this is something that he had sort of been considering. And while we were working on this, a couple other groups published similar attacks.
Cool.
Yeah. In fact, there are some other similar implementation level attacks where, due to restrictions in the size of blocks in the blockchain, an individual channel can only, an individual node can only be a part of some maximum number of concurrent transactions, which is like, it's like 470 or something. And so another form of griefing is that you just send a bunch of tiny payments through one of the nodes, and then that node cannot support any additional transactions of any size because it's just used up all of its slots.
That's interesting. So you could imagine a pretty effective DDoS kind of strategy working here, where everybody just sends tiny little minute payments to people to knock them off the network.
Yeah, and you don't need much money to do it. The number, the 470 number, is sort of fundamental to the blockchain, which, I mean, there's like probably wars going on to determine what the correct blockchain size is in the Bitcoin world. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
I've got a question. I came in kind of late, but I've just found myself wondering what would be somebody's motivation or incentive to do something like this. And I know you said you don't need much money, but even to grief, like even if you're just a guy who's smart, that's had a bad day, that wants to mess with some people, you still have to pay fees for this work to be done just in order to grief. Is that right? And so I guess yeah, go ahead.
So first off, you don't need to pay any fees to Grief. I mean, you have to have channels in the network, and so there's cost associated with having the channels, but those are sort of guaranteed through cryptography. You're not losing money. All you need to Grief is to delay. So anytime somebody wants to forward a payment through you, you just stop. You accept it and say you're going to forward it, and then you just stop. So there's really no cost associated with that. To answer your other question, so Max was getting at this a little bit before. The incentives might not necessarily be trying to make any money with this present incarnation of the attack, but to slow down the network in general, to stop other people from performing financial transactions, which is something that maybe an individual having a bad day might not care much about, but like nation states, they've been known to do pettier things.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
I mean, I would point out that Russia like spends money on having hackers break into almost arbitrary seeming American businesses and just cause like random damage, right? Frequently.
Yeah.
So
Totally.
there's a lot of American businesses that rely on the cryptocurrency space. Like none of them come to mind. Anyway, they exist. And so therefore there are kind of obvious financial targets in that sense. But what's that one I was complaining about the other day, that they have all the ads where they're like, we'll teach you about cryptocurrency for free. On YouTube, they're like the main company people buy and sell on. Jacob, do you remember? They just had an IPO.
No,
Coinbase?
Yeah, Coinbase. Yeah, those slimy Coinbase people would be exactly the sort of target that that Russia would go after.
Yeah, totally. Plus, if somebody thought that this was this network had sufficient privacy and that other means of payment were more trackable or whatever, more aligned with their interests, they might try to just take down this network so that the people use other means to perform their payments.
Right, like China has their own cryptocurrency, right? There's their nation state cryptocurrency they're coming out with. And so it would be in their best interest to make other cryptocurrencies essentially unusable in order to drive people onto the nationally controlled one, as a concrete example.
Yeah.
Cool. I think we have time for like one or two more questions if anybody has any outstanding items they'd like to ask.
I guess I have a more personal question for you, Ben, which is that future research, are you interested in looking more at these types of things or investigating something else?
So I do have one project continuing in this payment channel space. We're actually looking at the gossip methods used by the Lightning protocol. So when channels need to be updated, new channels are created and new nodes are added to the network, each node needs to spread that through gossip. And there's not really been any work in this area, so we're starting by trying to come up with a formal model of this. Max, this is what I was asking you those questions.
Yeah, the other day.
Yeah, so yeah, we're gonna go down that route, see if we can generate some attacks or something along that line. Otherwise, a lot of the other open questions in the payment channel space are more interesting to cryptographers. So I probably won't go down that route.
Yeah, Ben, now that I've seen
So
the paper, oh, I'm sorry, Jacob, go ahead.
Oh no, it's a quick one. So gossip in this case, does this relate at all to IPFS gossip sub, or is it just a good name to talk about propagating information?
So gossiping is just it's a general term for, it's also called epidemic routing, where nodes just tell their neighbors and their neighbors tell their neighbors. Gossip sub is a specific instantiation that's used in IPFS. The Lightning Network gossips, but does not use gossip sub. It uses its own home-baked gossip algorithm.
Cool. Thank you.
I was just going to say, Ben, that now that I've seen your presentation, I'm wondering if maybe you should look at Petri nets for modeling, because Petri nets have this like first-class representation of resources moving from place to place. And so you have like, I don't know much about Petri nets, but my understanding is that you have some notion that a state can like have a certain amount of resources, and then those resources can be passed from one state to a different state. So it's sort of a nice way to model this idea of like money moving around, or there being a balance across a particular channel. So maybe that'd be worth looking into.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I might want to talk to you more about that later.
Okay, sounds good.
Max,
Cool.
what are they called?
Go for it.
Max, what are the things the Petri nuts? Is that what are they called?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
it's Petri, but I'm no expert.
It seems like like graph theoretic accounting or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. But it's like, I think of it like, you know, that game with the marbles that you move around inside. It's like baklava or something.
Oh, Mancala.
Yeah, Mancala. Petri nets are kind of like that. Like you have these little marbles and you can like move them from like slot to slot. That's my understanding, but I've never actually worked with them. I've just like read the definition a couple times on Wikipedia. So I might be totally off the mark.
Yeah, it's like, I'm gonna say, if you have like a marble in one spot, you like follow the arrows, and then you have a marble in like the two things at the end of those arrows. And then you have the other where you need like a marble and the beginning of both arrows, and those will appearing will get a marble at the end of that arrow. There's like dozens of different variations as well. Like you'd have timed versions, and it's essentially a generalization of an concept, but with all the other generalizations, you can take off the.
Well, Ben, it sounds like you should talk to Daniel.
Yeah, you sound like the guy who knows about these. I might reach out if I decide to get on that.
I don't know much more about Petri nets than that. It's we like did like 30 minutes on them in one class, and that's about it.
Okay. Cool.
Fantastic. Well, Ben, thank you so much for coming on to talk to us today. This is a very fun one. And unless anybody objects, I'll be putting the recording online at some point in the near future so that other people can enjoy it who do not see it. Surprisingly, people actually watch this stuff. Like if you go on YouTube, some of the videos we put up have like 50 views, which is 50 more than I expected. So that's pretty rad.
Yeah. My mom's gonna watch this 50 times. So.
Awesome. Perfect. I have those views up. So we appreciate your time. And if people want to reach out to you, they can go onto the website for the Boston Computation Club and find your name, which is a link, and click on it, and it goes to your website. And then they can email you. So that is easy enough. So thanks again, Ben. And I guess we'll hopefully see you in the future.
Yeah, right. Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
Thanks, Ryan. It was awesome.
Thank you.